Good morning, everyone. So, today we are leaving Europe and we're moving once again to America. In 1492, an Italian explorer named Christopher Columbus set sail from Spain looking for a shorter way to reach India. Instead, he found a whole new continent, a whole new world. America. Only 30 years later, the Kingdom of Spain had conquered huge parts of South America and confirmed itself as the world's first and most powerful colonial power. This, however, came at a price, especially for the people who lived in America. Millions of natives were killed by the guns, germs, and steel of the Spaniards, and those who survived were forced to convert to Christianity and live as slaves. Today, we will be looking at the conquest of the New World, and in particular, we will be looking at the following points. So, at the discovery of the New World, I'll say a couple of things about the Aztec Empire and the Aztec civilization very briefly. Then we'll look at the Spanish Conquest and at the reasons why they were able to conquer it so quickly. And finally, we're going to ask ourselves, was it a genocide, an adventure, or both? And finally, in the transcript, you will also find a model answer for today's question, which is, how did the Spanish conquer the New World? Let's start by looking at the age of discovery. Around the end of the 15th century, many Western European countries, in particular Portugal and Spain, were looking for new trading routes that did not need to cross the Mediterranean Sea, which at the time was controlled by Muslim states and by the Italian cities. They wanted to find a way to get their hands onto those very rich and very expensive spices that could give a lot of money to anyone who was able to take them from India to Europe and they wanted to avoid going through the intermediation of the Ottomans or the Egyptians or the Italians, because the more people you add as middlemen when you're trying to trade, the less money you earn. You want to go there straight, take the thing and move out of the way without anyone else getting involved. With time, by looking for new ways to India, they discovered places like the Canary Islands and the Azores, which are groups of islands off the coast of Africa, which are now inhabited by Spaniards and Portuguese, respectively. And these new discoveries encouraged them to keep pushing forwards, and eventually the kings of Spain and the kings of Portugal began to sponsor navigators who wanted to sail around the world. In 1492, Christopher Columbus, who was working for the Queen of Spain, was the first European, after the Vikings, to set foot in America, discovering the Caribbean islands. 5 years later, in 1497, the King of England, Henry VII, sponsored the voyages of another Italian navigator, John Cabot, who made a detailed map of the coast of North America, again for the first time in history. In the same year, the Portuguese explorer Vasco da Gama was also the first person to travel by boat from Europe all the way to India, and his actions, together with the voyages of many others who explored the coast of Africa, explored trading routes to India, allowed the Kingdom of Portugal to become unexpectedly rich and influential, because it controlled the key to the most lucrative trade in the entire world. The Portuguese, as shown by this map, would eventually go on to colonize and control Asia, mostly Asia and Africa, mostly focusing on these areas and a few enclaves on the coast of India and the famous Spice Island. They also had a presence in Brazil, but it would only grow up later. The Spanish, however, focused more on America, and more precisely on South and Central America. Now, when Columbus and other European explorers first set foot in America, the continent was inhabited by those peoples who had reached it during the Stone Age. So they did not discover it. They discovered it for the Europeans. People were already living there. Well, some of those people were still technologically very backward. We will say they still lived in the Stone Age. They had very sophisticated and rich cultures. They knew how to read and write. They knew how to make gigantic cities with monumental architectures. Think of all the Aztec pyramids in Central America. Those are absolutely fantastic monuments. There was nothing in Spain comparable to Aztec architecture at the time. The Aztec Empire was, again, one of these empires, and they were the major power in the regions. They were the strongest state in Central America at the time. They were a nation of warriors who had built an empire in what is now Mexico. Here you see a picture or a modern picture of Aztec warriors. The Aztecs believed that war could be sacred. Okay, that war was a way to show your courage to the gods, in a way, and also that their gods needed to drink the blood of their enemies, or else they would destroy the entire world. This was one of the central beliefs of the Aztec religion in the way I understand it. I might be wrong. But they needed to sacrifice the beating out of the prisoners of wars to the gods. So they led them in up on the top of these gigantic pyramids, and they opened their hearts with obsidian knives, took their hearts and sacrificed it to the gods. If they didn't do that, if they didn't feed blood to the gods, they believed that they would send on the end of the world. According to their mythology, the world had already ended 4 times before, and one time the angry gods killed all of humanity by making jaguars rain from the sky, not the cars, the big angry cats. However, despite this passion for blood and war, the Aztec had been able to build a very complex and again sophisticated and rich civilization which thrived, traded, and crafted beautiful artwork. And yet, despite the wealth and despite the warrior abilities of the Aztecs, the Spanish conquistadors, conquistador is a Spanish word for conqueror, the Spanish conquistadors were able to invade and destroy their kingdom in just a few years. Now, how did they do that? We have already tackled similar issues when discussing the British Empire at the beginning of the year, but it is such an important part of human history that it will not hurt repeating it. The Spanish and the other European nations were able to win because they had guns, germs, and steel. So, guns. The Europeans had recently perfected the military use of gunpowder. It was invented by the Chinese. It arrived in Europe possibly through the intermediation of the Mongols. This is also one of the reasons why we study them. But it was the Europeans who were constantly fighting each other, constantly trying to find new ways to kill each other, who invented, who made, no, not invented, who made them working as weapons. Okay, so they invented the arquebus and the muskets, which were early forms of guns. We would call them rifled, but they were not rifled. They invented the cannons and they invented the pistol, the handgun. These weapons were incredibly powerful compared to anything the Aztecs or any other native people had. But they were also very, very loud, and they made smokes, and I wouldn't personally blame the Aztecs if they believed, and I think they did, that it was magic, that it was a boomstick, and that these people were maybe not gods, but something very similar. But it was not just that. There were also germs. Now, Europe and Asia and Africa had always been in contact, okay? And this meant that, yes, people could trade, like through the Silk Road. We discussed it in one of the last lessons. They could go from Mongolia to Europe without being bothered. But it was not just people, it was also bacteria that could spread from one continent to another. So if a smallpox epidemic started, I don't know, in Asia, it would eventually reach Europe. With time, the people of Eurasia and Africa became somewhat immune to many of these diseases because the disease arrived, killed the weaker people. Some of the people who were able to resist it transmitted the genes to the future generations, and then when the next wave arrived, they would survive. The Aztecs, however, did not have this sort of exposition. They didn't have this sort of experience and had no defense against them. This meant that even before the Spanish conquistadors actually set foot in Mexico, thousands of Aztecs and other natives were dying of disease that the Spanish had brought in with their ships. And finally, steel. The Europeans had perfected metalworking technology for military purposes, and they could make weapons and armors out of steel, rather than just stone or copper, as the Aztecs did. In general, they had a much higher level of military technology. They also had tall ships, they also had horses. The Native Americans did not have horses. And all these things allowed them to fight much more effectively. There were, of course, many other reasons. For example, the Aztecs were despised by many of the people that they had subjugated, that they had conquered, because the Aztecs were themselves an empire that had expanded recently. And after all, I mean, I cannot blame them because nobody wants to be ruled by some people who may break into your house, kidnap you, and then sacrifice you to a bloodthirsty god. And so the question is, was it a genocide, was it an adventure, or was it both? Now, by 1530, the entirety of Mexico had been conquered by the Spanish, led by a guy named Hernan Cortes, the most famous of the conquistadors, the leader for the conquest of Mexico. In previous decades, historians and teachers tended to stress the fact that the conquest of Mexico had been like a great adventure, and one can understand where this thought comes from. I mean, after all, we are talking about the story of a handful of people, thirsty for glory and for gold, who explored an unknown world covered in jungle, covered in strange people, and conquered it, and were able to fight the locals and win, despite all odds. I mean, it does make for a good story. And it is, after all, the way this story has been told in the first half of the 20th century. However, lately, and when I say lately, I mean in the past 50 years essentially, more people have begun to question this view, and most historians try to, sorry, I made a typo here, have begun to question this view. And most historians, and also most teachers, including myself, try to focus on what the conquest must have looked like for the Aztecs from the point of view of the native peoples. And the situation looks, to be honest, more like a genocide and less like a thrilling adventure. First of all, about half of the native population was killed by the disease brought by the Europeans. It's difficult to blame the Spaniards for this specific thing since they did not know about it. They didn't know about germs and about the transmission, but it happened, and it was absolutely devastating. Half or two-thirds of the entire American population before the conquest. However, there is something that the Spanish can be blamed for after the conquest, and it is the way they treated the natives. The natives were forced to convert to Christianity, to abandon their own gods, and they were often forced, at least at the beginning, to work as slaves in terrible conditions. Then things sort of changed for a while, but it's complicated. The natives worked in the silver and gold mines, long story short, that allowed Spain to become the richest country in Europe. And this is very important because the same thing would later happen to Portugal, the Netherlands, Britain, France, and other colonial countries in Europe. The huge wealth which allowed them to rule the entire world for 2 whole centuries was the product of colonial exploitation and of the slave labor of millions of people. If Britain had become the richest country in the world, it was because it exploited India, Africa, and all its other possessions. If the countries of South America, Africa, and Southeast Asia have now a lot of poor people, have an incredibly high poverty rate, it is mainly because of the European colonization. So I leave this to you. What is the most important aspect of the Spanish conquest of Mexico? Is it the fact that it was a thrilling adventure of heroes crossing the ocean and finding a new, exciting world to fight the battle scene, or was it the fact that these people won and they treated the people that they conquered incredibly poorly in a way that resembles genocide? Okay, that's it for today. I'm looking forward to read what you can write, and see you next time.